Nationalization, price controls, welfare programs, and economic collapse, lessons from the Venezuelan experience, written by Dr. Roberto Raymundo of the Economics Department, School of Economics, De La Salle University. Introduction. The promise of providing free education, free health care, free food, and free housing alongside conditional and unconditional cash transfers, unemployment benefits, and general pensions through a government program is conventionally used by politicians to get votes and win an election campaign. Promises of free benefits will always attract more political support, particularly from voters who believe that government is the solution to all economic problems and that there is a need for direct public intervention in order to correct the inequitable distribution of income and wealth in society and achieve greater equality. Unfortunately, history has shown that massive government intervention in the form of public programs that provide free benefits actually results to unintended bad outcomes, which include destroying the incentive to work, reducing productivity, increasing voluntary unemployment, increasing public debt, raising taxes, discouraging investment and innovation, decreasing the efficiency and competitiveness of industries, and destroying productive capacity and worsening chronic inflation. This situation is further worsened by the fact that welfare state programs are also accompanied by aggressive government intervention in the form of nationalizing firms and industries, imposing price controls, granting subsidies, and protecting local enterprises with special privileges under a crony capitalist arrangement using tariff and non-tariff barriers and industrial regulations which restrict the entry of other potential competitors into the industry. The failure of massive public intervention through government ownership of the means of production, or socialism, is clearly shown in the experiences of countries who suffered severe economic collapse, such as the Soviet Union in 1991 and China during the Great Famines in 1958 to 1962, along with its widespread poverty problem, which worsened up to 1979. Britain and India had implemented a form of socialism by allowing government to take over heavy industries, impose protectionist policies, use restrictive regulations, and provide welfare state programs after the Second World War. Both countries experienced severe economic crisis, Britain in 1979 and India in 1991, which can be attributed to the socialist policies that led to the accumulation of enormous public debts, high fiscal deficits, large trade deficits, a balance of payments crisis, rising chronic inflation, and high interest rates resulting to a severe economic downturn. This forced the two countries to consequently abandon their primary socialist policies by dismantling government ownership and relinquishing control of heavy industries, removing protectionist policies, and reducing government regulations that discourage new investment and competition. Chile adopted socialist policies which provided various entitlement programs to its citizens, along with the nationalization of industries and expropriation of firms, the imposition of higher minimum wages, price controls, subsidies, and high tariff rates on imports to protect local industries. Socialism, the welfare state, and heavy government participation in almost all activities of the citizenry became an excuse for excessive government intervention. Alongside inadequate tax collections, the socialist policy created enormous public debts, high chronic inflation, negative economic growth, and a highly unstable economy. The economy of Chile was in crisis by 1972, inducing a military coup that ousted the Marxist President Salvador Allende by 1973. Why massive public intervention fails. Number 1. Inefficient production under government ownership. Nationalization of firms and/or industries. Government protects its monopoly position by preventing the entry of other firms into the industry, which eliminates competition and allows the public enterprise to continue producing low-quality products and services at high average costs, sold at higher prices, and continuously demands subsidies from the national government in order to cover rising operational costs. Under free markets, inefficient firms fail and close down when they cannot stay competitive and cannot convince buyers to purchase their goods. This is the natural penalty for inefficient operations in a free market. This penalty, however, does not exist when a government enterprise operates as a monopoly. Moral hazard. Government-owned monopolies are not allowed to fail, despite their inefficiencies, and this makes the public enterprise behave even more inefficiently in the long run because of the absence of any penalty or discipline imposed by the market. Government administrators do not have any incentive to improve efficiency because even when the public enterprise incurs deficits or losses, it will not be allowed to fail and will be bailed out or subsidized in order to continue operations, with the subsidies being shouldered by the taxpayers. When a firm is owned by government, there is realistically no individual in society which has a personal claim or stake in the enterprise. Therefore, when the firm suffers losses, no individual or citizen will take the initiative to correct its inefficiencies because there will be no personal incentive to do this. In general, every citizen benefiting from the public enterprise will just rely on government subsidizing the firm's operations in order to continue its inefficient and wasteful existence. Inefficient production under price controls. Price controls such as price ceilings are supposed to make goods more affordable to the consumer by setting a price lower than the prevailing market price. However, this has the effect of discouraging production and investment because it drastically reduces the opportunity to earn profits. Price controls consequently create prolonged shortages, rationing, long queues, and black or informal markets, making it more difficult for consumers to get access to goods and services. Products disappear from the shelves of groceries and department stores when price controls are imposed on a permanent basis. Inefficient production under subsidies. Subsidies granted to government-owned and or protected private sector firms ensure the continuation of inefficient, high-cost and wasteful operations, which penalizes the consumer with higher prices and poor product quality, alongside higher taxation in the future in order to fund the subsidies. Inefficient production under restrictive government regulations. Restrictive government regulations such as requiring the payment of huge franchise fees in order to enter an industry, along with unreasonably high quality control standards and strict production facility and storage requirements, all have the effect of limiting entry into the market, discouraging new investment, and eliminating competition. Without competition, the industry fails to develop, falls behind its foreign counterparts, and remains uncompetitive to the detriment of the consumer and the productive capacity of the economy overall. Fiscal deficits and inflation. Chronic fiscal deficit spending financed by monetizing public debt is responsible for creating inflation that reduces the value of money, increases the cost of all goods and services, and reduces the value of real income, leading to a deterioration in living standards. Inflation over several years reduces the value of real wages and salaries, savings, pensions, and other retirement benefits. Inflation is a hidden tax and is shouldered by every income-earning individual. Deficit spending funded by the central bank's creation of new money allows government to continually spend beyond its means and transfer this cost to the general public in the form of inflation and a guarantee of more taxation in the future. As inflation continues to spike, higher prices reduce consumer and investment spending, slows down aggregate demand, slows down sales, induces losses which leads to production cuts, firm closures, worker layoffs, and a worsening recession. As the recession gets worse, lesser tax revenues are generated, which leads to more government borrowing, more central bank money creation, and higher inflation as the newly created money is spent by government. The creation and printing of new money becomes even more prevalent as the debt-ridden country fails to get new foreign loans to finance importation. The government will be more dependent on borrowing larger amounts of central bank printed money in an attempt to produce goods and services which it inefficiently performs in an economy without any competition and weak productive capacity. The excessive printing of domestic currency by the central bank to fund rising government debt leads to hyperinflation. The Venezuelan experience. Venezuela used to be the wealthiest economy in South America, with a per capita income higher than Japan and China and close to that of the United States during the decade of the 1950s and the 1960s. It has the largest oil reserves in South America and one of the largest in the world, rivaling that of Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and Iraq. Venezuela was certified to have the world's largest proven oil reserves between 2007 to 2011, standing at 316 billion barrels. When oil prices crashed during the decade of the 1980s and the 1990s, the Venezuelan economy experienced downturns which consequently became severe recessions that prompted the public to elect a new president by the name of Hugo Chavez. He was elected president in December 1998 and took office in February 1999. Upon assuming the presidency, Hugo Chavez implemented socialist policies that were primarily funded by rising oil revenue exports caused by soaring oil prices during the year 2000. Tax revenue collection was inadequate due to the weak performance of all the other sectors in the economy outside of the oil industry. As president, Chavez rewrote the Venezuelan constitution, guaranteeing citizens the right to free healthcare, free college education, free housing, and other government-granted benefits that would move society towards greater equality in income, wealth, and opportunities. Socialism totally engulfed Venezuela when Chavez was re-elected in 2006 and was fully in control of the courts and the legislature. Authorized government agencies were to seize privately owned wealth and property from Venezuela's citizens, all in the name of achieving fairness and equity. Hugo Chavez took control of the nation's oil industry, expelled all foreign investors, nationalized power companies, broadcast and telecommunication firms, farms, mines, banks, and grocery stores. Hugo Chavez died from cancer in 2013, and his successor, Nicolas Maduro, continued to implement Chavez's socialist plan with greater impunity on the Venezuelan people. At present, Venezuela is descending into anarchy, with record numbers of Venezuelan migrants fleeing northward, desperately trying to reach the border of the United States. Riots and violent political protests are common in the streets, while shops, groceries, and department stores have empty shelves. There are severe shortages in all basic goods and services, which have driven the poor, the lower and middle income households to desperation, particularly to the point of slaughtering pets and zoo animals and rummaging through garbage in order to find food. Some households are settling for rotting beef if and when it is available, and crime rates have increased, particularly the incidences of murder, robbery, and theft. Hyperinflation, evidence of Venezuela's failed economy. Based on figures released by the Central Bank of Venezuela, the inflation rate of the country was at 5,500% in 2021. Hyperinflation, defined as 50% inflation per month at the least, began in 2014 at 62.2% and has continually increased to reach its peak at 65,374% in 2018. Double-digit inflation has occurred regularly from 1984 up to 2014, with peaks at 84.5% in 1989 and 99.9% in 1996. Triple-digit hyperinflation began in 2015 at 121.7% and has continually increased to become a five-figure hyperinflation rate by 2018. Hyperinflation and deficit spending. The ratio of the fiscal deficit to GDP was at 22.99% in 2017. It became 31% in 2018, 10% in 2019, and 5.05% for the year 2020. For the year 2017, the estimated ratio of public debt to gross domestic product was at 26%. This increased to 180.8% in 2018, 232.8% in 2019, and 304.1% in 2020. This confirms that the Venezuelan central bank has been excessively printing local currency because the primary outcome of financing fiscal deficits and public debt with money creation is the five-digit hyperinflation recorded in 2019 and 2020 and the four-digit hyperinflation figures shown in 2020. A reduction in hyperinflation only becomes possible if lesser central bank money creation is used to finance public debts and the fiscal deficit. Negative growth in gross domestic product. Growth in gross domestic product has been negative from 2014 up to 2022, with the largest decline recorded in 2019 at negative 35%, followed by 2020 at negative 30%, 2018 at negative 19.6%, 2016 at negative 17%, and 2017 at negative 15.7%. The lowest declines in GDP recorded during this period was at negative 3.9% in 2014, followed by negative 5% in 2022, negative 6.2% in 2015, and negative 10% in 2021. The Venezuelan economy shrank, with real GDP declining from $562.1 billion in 2013 to $144.7 billion by 2020. Double-digit unemployment. From 1999 to 2006, double-digit unemployment was recorded, with the highest at 18.2% in 2003 and the lowest at 10% in 2006. This outcome was repeated from 2016 to 2019, with unemployment rising from 20.9 to 27.9 to 35.5 and 44% respectively. Reduced job creation because of the lack of new investments in the private sector, along with the excess supply of graduates coming from state colleges and universities, has contributed substantially to the double-digit unemployment from 1999 to 2006 and from 2016 to 2019. Peaks and troughs in oil prices. The Venezuelan recessions from 2002 to 2003, as well as from 2009 to 2010, are both associated with reductions in oil prices in the world market. International crude oil prices decreased from $55 per barrel in November 2000 to $31 per barrel in January 2002, and the economy shrank by negative 8.9% and negative 7.8% in 2002 and 2003 respectively. World crude oil prices also fell from $182 per barrel in June 2008 to $56 per barrel in June 2009, and the economy contracted by negative 3.2% and negative 1.5% in 2009 and 2010 respectively. When international crude oil prices fell from $122 per barrel in May 2014 to $20.9 per barrel in April 2020, the economy continuously shrank from 2014 up to 2020, with GDP falling from $562.1 billion in 2013 to $144.7 billion by 2020. World oil prices increased to $95.72 per barrel in February 2022, but the economy continued to be in a recession, with the GDP falling by negative 10% in 2021 and is further expected to decline by negative 5% in 2022. Although recessions in Venezuela can be related to the occurrence of declines in world oil prices, the fact remains that the economy is weak and largely underdeveloped in the productive capacity of its other industrial sectors outside of oil from 1999 up to the present. The economy is heavily dependent on only one productive sector, which is oil. And despite the many years of rising oil prices in the 1970s, the 1990s, the period from 2002 up to 2008, 2009 to 2011, 2016 to 2018, and from 2020 to 2022, there have been no improvements in the ability to produce in the other sectors of the economy. The Venezuelan government, with its nationalized oil industry, had squandered the gains from high international oil prices and did not make any attempts to invest its enormous oil revenues in developing the productive capacity of the other sectors of the economy. The impact of socialist policies. When world oil prices fell, the country could not depend on any other sector to save the economy from a recession. The lack of development in the other productive sectors is caused by the absence of new investments, non-existent competition, and no opportunities for other prospective businessmen because of, number one, the government ownership of the means of production, nationalization of industries. Number two, the special privileges given to crony capitalists through protectionism and strict regulations that limit entry into industries and consequently eliminates competition. Number three, price controls that create shortages and discourage production and investment into heavily demanded goods. Number four, subsidies that allow firms, both public and private enterprises, to continue operations even if average costs are high, product quality is poor, and prices are exorbitant. And number five, welfare state benefits that increase public debt and induce more money creation by the central bank, which leads to hyperinflation and severe economic collapse. A deteriorating national oil industry. Venezuela's hydrocarbons industry has completely collapsed after 7 years of mismanagement and political purges. The dismantling of Petróleos de Venezuela, its managerial structures, and deviations in long-standing company policy implemented by the government of Nicolas Maduro since 2014. These actions have undermined the sector and destabilized the national economy. The last report by the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries shows that Venezuela produced only 527,000 barrels of oil per day in September 2021. This is equivalent to a reduction of 2.49 million barrels per day, or an 82.9% decline in production capacity compared to the output levels in 2013. This decline is unprecedented in the history of any oil-producing country that has not suffered a depletion of reservoirs, war, or international or internal armed conflict. Price controls. During the year 2003, price controls were imposed on roughly 400 basic food items in an attempt to control inflation and help the poor by making these goods more affordable. In 2009, 12 basic food items that included white rice, cooking oil, coffee, sugar, powdered milk, cheese, and tomato sauce were subject to minimum production quotas under a price control scheme which further worsened the shortage. This outcome occurred because the production quotas could not be met, as the average cost of production of these goods went beyond the price controls. Price controls, which are designed to keep goods and services affordable, have always resulted to shortages because it eliminates the opportunity to earn profits, which consequently discourages production and new investments into the industry. Nationalization of industries. The nationalization of production enterprises beginning in 2006 included industries such as cement, telecommunications, electric power, steel, construction, and food processing. This led to substantial decreases in the production of output, which can be attributed to the political appointment of inept government administrators and their inefficient management, non-existent competition, as government-owned firms were protected with tariffs, non-tariff barriers, and strict regulations along with subsidies, the absence of innovation, and finally, the lack of new investments to replace worn-out capital after the government took over operations. Bad outcomes from welfare state programs. Welfare state programs may have good intentions but tend to create more bad outcomes for the economy in the long term. Free education at the tertiary level produces an excess supply of college graduates who cannot find work, which requires the use of their acquired skills. This partially explains the consistent occurrence of double-digit unemployment for more than 2 decades. This is further worsened by the lack of job creation and investment in the private sector. The quality of education declines when it is provided for free by government because of the absence of competition from other educational institutions and the failure of students to take courses seriously because it does not require them to shoulder its true cost. Free healthcare creates long lines of patients in public hospitals who cannot provide enough services and equipment to meet demand. Initially, public hospitals received enough financial support when government allocations were funded by oil revenues during the period of high oil prices in the world market. But as the world oil prices fell, the financial resources of the Venezuelan government decreased substantially, with the public sector receiving lesser funding support for its operations. Free housing always begins with the construction of new facilities, but in the long term always leads to poorly maintained tenements and the creation of inner-city ghettos with high poverty and crime rates. Residents will not spend on maintenance or improvement as long as they do not own the housing facility. Cash transfers and unemployment benefits destroy the incentive to work and increase voluntary unemployment. Generous pensions for the elderly lose their value in the long term because of hyperinflation, as government attempts to finance deficit spending by borrowing more printed money from a central bank. Conclusions. During the early stages of the implementation of socialism, initial positive signs of improvement in the conditions of the poor may be observed because of the provision of welfare state programs in the form of free education, free healthcare, free housing, free food, cash transfers, and generous pensions for the elderly. This is accompanied by the control of prices and the use of subsidies to keep goods affordable and the government ownership of the means of production to ensure the continuous flow of goods and services in the economy. However, these policies are not sustainable and always lead to inefficiency, the misallocation of resources, corruption, the accumulation of public debt, chronic high inflation, and in severe cases hyperinflation, and higher taxation, which destroys the incentive to invest, to produce, innovate, and compete. Providing welfare state programs without adequate taxation leads to the accumulation of larger public debts. Inflation caused by government through excessive deficit spending actually makes the poor worse off by increasing the cost of living way beyond the wages that the workers are able to earn. Inflation reduces the value of income and savings, and individuals relying on pensions consequently realize that they cannot live as comfortably as they used to when the cost of living rises. Venezuela initially funded its socialist programs with enormous oil export revenues during the period of rising world oil prices under the Hugo Chavez administration. However, these oil revenues decreased when oil prices declined, and with an economy whose productive capacity was weak and underdeveloped because of socialism, could not generate enough taxation to finance government spending. The country became dependent on domestic debt, which was unsustainable, that led to chronic hyperinflation and its economic collapse. Fiscal deficit spending allows government to expand, accumulate more public debt, and impose more taxation, which in the long run discourages private sector investment, stifles entrepreneurial activity, reduces the capacity of the economy to produce goods and services, and decreases the rate at which jobs are created. Unemployment increases the incidence of poverty, and unfortunately, this situation induces more calls for government to further intervene, which makes economic conditions far worse. Sustained growth, low inflation, and reduced unemployment can only be achieved in the long term when huge fiscal deficits are eliminated, public debts are reduced, and the role of government as the welfare state is dismantled, along with the creation of more opportunities for production, trade, and investment. Thank you for listening.